Actually, climate changes are happening 70 years earlier than predicted.
Vietnam underwater, under seawater, 95% of the landmass of the country under seawater in just 30 years' time.
The human brain isn't particularly well suited for assessing catastrophic risk.
Saudi Arabia, net zero. BP, net zero. Shell, net zero.
I just came here to COP because I felt that my government was not doing enough to protect its people.
Pooran, what was the trigger of that heightened concern when you contacted me after watching the interview with Sir David?
Well, you know, like many other people, I've been working in the environmental field for, over 30 years. And then it was those extreme weather events that we experienced this year, starting with the 5 degrees hotter in, on the North American West Coast, and then the floods in Germany, China and the USA. And actually watching an interview with Sir David King, where, Sir David was saying that actually climate changes are happening 70 years earlier than predicted. And I'd always suspected that actually the accepted models of climate change weren't taking into enough the tipping points that might exist. And having, never really being short for words, I didn't know how to respond.
The follow through from this is threefold, and the whole planet is impacted by this. The first is, there sitting in that blue sea during the Arctic polar summer is Greenland. As Greenland ice is now melting also with a positive feedback, sea levels will rise by 7.5 meters. I'm talking about the global average sea level rise. The map of the world dramatically changed. How long will it take? Well, it may take several hundred years, but even if we get to 0.5 meter sea level rise, let me give you a prediction that's been made by a group of climate scientists fairly recently on the country of Vietnam, which is a country that the Mekong River has created this big delta, and the whole country is basically silt brought down over many thousands of years. It's very close to sea level. Vietnam underwater, under seawater, 95% of the landmass of the country under seawater in just 30 years' time. So these are the predictions that emerge from the irreversible, unless we can step in and change this, irreversible loss of ice on land around the world, eventually leading to a sea level rise of 20 meters. That's on the cards now. It may take 1,000 years, but we can look back 3,000 years. Apparently we can't look forward more than 100. But the second thing is that in that permafrost is a vast amount of methane. And methane release is now happening explosively, creating big craters, 50 meters diameter, 60 meters deep. And about 1,000 of these craters have now been formed. There's enough methane there that as the permafrost melts, global temperatures will rise 20 degrees centigrade. We're looking at a different world, which is already now happening. And we need to step in and attempt, and this is what we're trying to do at Cambridge, working globally with other partners, attempting to buy time by refreezing the Arctic, and then attempting also to see if we can remove greenhouse gases to bring them down to 350 parts per million. And frankly, unless we do these things, we're cooked.
We have lots of built stuff that has all been built on the assumption that our climate is stable. That is now a poor assumption. The past can no longer guide us. So if you look at the built environment in Glasgow or where I live, Washington, DC, pretty much every decision that has been made has assumed that the extreme events of the past, the highest winds, the highest heat, the flooding levels are what we will encounter in the future. That turns out to be a big challenge for us. Our building codes, pretty much across the globe, which are the building codes are what keep us safe in our buildings, and they are what allow the buildings to survive a bad event. Those building codes are based on historical data. they do not yet include future data. So any infrastructure will ping up now unless there's a very involved engineer or a concerned owner is built for what's in the past. This is a critical moment as we need to spend more to cut our emissions to avoid the very worst, but we also need to make sure that we're making smart decisions. And to get to your question, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need broader recognition that it's smart to invest in risk reduction. The studies in the United States show that for every dollar we spend on risk reduction, we save about $11 in damages. And if we don't save a community, we see really cascading economic impacts that are not reflected in the economic modeling. I'll give you an example. In 2017 and 18, we had devastating wildfires in California. The town of Paradise, a lower middle class town in the mountains of California, burned to the ground. 8 people died, and 20,000 people overnight were thrown into another adjoining town called Chico, California. Chico already suffered from affordable housing challenges, and suddenly 20,000 people appear with kindergartners who need to get enrolled in school, people looking for jobs, people looking for a place to live. Highly difficult situation for both those that have been displaced and the receiving communities. But the modeling doesn't really pick up beyond that economic dislocation to what else happened. Turned out that the fires got so hot that the piping underneath Paradise melted, perhaps spreading toxic chemicals to the water supply. We then saw that the wildfire smoke caused health implications, increased asthma, increased respiratory disease, including all the way over to where I live in Washington, DC. The smoke was that bad. And now we are having a atmospheric river has dumped a lot of rain on California. And we're seeing mudslides because that very scarred area with intense heat from these wildfires that burn hotter makes the land so tough that the water, when it hits, just hits it and picks up boulders and everything else. And we have our reservoirs in the mountains in California threatening our freshwater supplies. So the lesson of all this is we need to invest now in thinking through what are the ramifications from climate change and make better decisions right now. In my opinion, this won't happen unless governments are deeply involved. We simply can't afford to sort of follow the laissez-faire approach that we had in the past, because the tool set we have right now hasn't caught up to the risks that we know are in our future.
Just to give like a bit of background about Namibia. Namibia is a very semi-arid area. It's in Southern Africa. And basically what we suffer from, like in terms of climate, we have a persistent drought, water scarcity, and we really lack like fresh water in Namibia. So basically for the past years, another thing about Namibia is also that we have a very high unemployment rate, which means that over 70% of the country's population, they depend on agriculture and farming. And because of the climate crisis that has been going on, the persistent drought and the water scarcity, it's been really difficult for people to survive. And most of the people have been losing their cattle, which has led to a lot of people living in poverty. One of the threats that we recently received is oil drilling in the Okavango Delta. The Okavango Delta is one of Namibia's freshest water points. Like that's where most of our fresh water comes from. So we have a country from Canada, a company from Canada called Recon Africa, and they assume that there might be oil in the Okavango Delta. So they've been trying to drill for oil in that area. And the way that it has been, the way they have been doing it from the beginning was wrong, because the country's population, we were not informed. Everything was done behind closed doors. And by the time we realized what was going on, Recon Africa was already on its way to Namibia. So it was a bit too late to do anything about it. Honestly, I just came here to COP because I felt that my government was not doing enough to protect its people. I feel like my government is like greedy and they're trying to put profits over people. I mean, we already do not have water, and the little water that we have, they're trying to drill for oil.
We're absolutely right to be talking about adaptation, and we should have been talking about it for the last 30 years. Am I seeing any sign that we're going to bend the emissions curve? Well, the rhetoric's been ramped up, but no, I don't think we're likely to bend the emissions curve. Net zero. Net zero. There was no reference to net zero in the assessment report 5, the IPCC. It's all over assessment report 6. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK, its 5th budget report 5 years ago, wasn't mentioned once. In its 6th budget report, that same phrase is used between 3,000 and 5,000 times. We use that word, that expression now, and anything fits into it. Saudi Arabia, net zero. BP, net zero. Shell, net zero. Every country basically aims at net zero. It has undermined the need for immediate and pressing action through a whole set of things that net zero captures. And it's really a requirement, I think, of a lot of us academics to pore over the spreadsheets that underpin the statements, if those spreadsheets exist at all, the net zero statements we hear in COP. So we look at India, comes out net zero 2070. There's nothing behind that. That's just an announcement pulled out the air at the last minute. But then you look at China, net zero 2060 and peaking emissions by 2026 to 2030. Just look at the emissions under that pathway. That blows 1.5 virtually out of the water. But then you come to the US, lots of grand talk, but its emissions per capita remain incredibly high for years to come, and it's not prepared to tackle the real challenges that climate change throws up on us. But then you go to the UK, you know, colonial as ever, we're the world leader on climate change, 44% reduction since 1990. Except for that excludes aviation and shipping emissions, and it also excludes our imports and exports. Then it's a 15% reduction since 1990, 0.5% a year. Much of that driven by reductions in coal, which are driven by the EU legislation on sulfur, not climate change. You unpick the rhetoric, and what you find underneath it is just a vacuous, empty space. And that's what we're seeing here. And until we are prepared to grasp the nettle and recognize that the climate and the temperature responds to physics, chemistry, and biology, not ephemeral economics, not short-term politics, then we are going to continue to fail. And who are we failing? I'm hoping to be here in 2050 with a bit of stem cell research, but we're really sort of we're failing you, your communities. We're failing a lot of the younger communities here. We're failing other species as well. And I think unless we are going to very rapidly, grasp the nettle, and we will not do it with our current leaders. They are not up to the job. They are ill-equipped and unable to understand the challenges that we face. Now, they may be pushed into making some decisions appropriately, but they will not be pushed through their own understanding of the issues. The rest of us have a job to play. Leadership is a partnership between bottom up and top down. And at the moment, the top down part is failing. But that partnership is always messy, but it's absolutely key. The marchers, the youth movements, the civil society groups are a key part of leadership. I think the cities need to be framing their thinking on climate change in relation to, let's reduce emissions, let's aim for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5, but let's plan for 4. Let's plan our infrastructure for the regional impacts of a global change of about 4 degrees. So that's the sort of direction that we're broadly pointing in. That will, of course, mean that any CBA, any cost-benefit analysis you do is going to be very challenging. I don't particularly like cost-benefit analysis anyway, but because you're going to have to think, well, what the costs of putting infrastructure in for 4 degrees centigrade is far more expensive than putting it in for 2 degrees centigrade. But if you put it in for 2 degrees centigrade, then you get hit by 4, then you've maladapted the future. And that's also very important for some of the countries that are developing their city infrastructures now. Do not follow examples of the West. Put the infrastructure in that is suitable for a very, very different climate from the one you've got today. And the final bit on citizen cities, and it's true across the board, I should have made that comment before, is the issue of equity. Equity between countries, but also equity within countries. And this is always the elephant in the room. And that's because who are the people that lead the climate change agenda? The climate scientists and academics, the barristers, the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, all of those in the top 1% of global emitters. So we never, ever talk about equity. The recent report from Oxfam, or the previous work from Chanson and Piketty, or the wonderful work from Julia Steinberg and others academically pointing out that half of global emissions come from 10% of the population. The top 1% of emitters are responsible for twice as much as the bottom 50%. Just imagine that number. The top 1% of global emitters are responsible for twice as much as half of the global population. How many of us here, how many of us in this room today are in that top 1%? And this is the problem for the mayors. They're not prepared yet to grasp this equity issue. And I think that is also key. We're not all in this together. There are very different elements to it, sort of split up by our socioeconomics. But that's the elephant in the room. We're not prepared to talk about those issues. So I think the mayors need to grasp the equity implications within the cities that they often are in control of.
And what I also want to say is, yeah, the global leaders, I totally agree with the comments that have been made about the poor leadership we currently have on all of these critical issues. But I think we've got to look for coalitions of willing countries, coalitions of willing cities, coalitions of willing people. Don't believe that everything happens at that global level. Germany developed feed-in tariffs, believe it or not, in 1989 to encourage all of the utilities and individuals to switch away from fossil fuels. Feed-in tariffs introduced in Germany, then in Britain, then across in Spain, Italy, France, etc., Europe and California. Feed-in tariffs and their equivalent have meant that renewable energy systems are now cheaper for most of the world than any other.
But for the fires in 2017 and 18 wiped out almost a quarter century worth of profit for the insurers insuring for wildfire. So at this point, some insurers have said we don't want to insure property in areas that we know are at high fire risk. Our regulator has stepped in and said to the insurers, you can't leave. If you want to do business in California, you're going to have to offer renewals to homeowners so that they can continue to get insurance. We've been doing this for several years. What will happen is eventually this will even become too big for the reinsurers. The president of, or the CEO of AXA has said a 3 to 4 degree world is uninsurable. I think the one way that is probably the most vivid to me, it's expensive, but it's deep engagement with communities. And we have one example of that in the United States, in the state of Louisiana. You may recall that along our Gulf Coast, it was hit with the BP oil spill. As a result of that oil spill, the state got a fair amount of money. It decided to use that money to engage with a number of equivalent of counties in that area. They had thousands of meetings. This is a deeply red, deeply Republican area in the United States where climate change isn't particularly welcome discussion. But through those meetings, those counties got to plans where they actually identified the land that would disappear as a result of sea level rise and subsidence. They're losing about a football field an hour of land in Louisiana, so it's important they figure out which communities will survive. Through that planning process, they were able to identify who's going to have to move.
It does look as though we're starting to cross certain tipping points with our climate, but they're social tipping points as well, and they're technological tipping points, they're economic tipping points. So can we facilitate and accelerate those tipping points, which will put us in a better place? And I wonder whether that's how we start really creating a story to get us out of this predicament. Because if we just face the facts as they are today, with the predictions of where we're going, we are in trouble. So how do we change really the story that we tell ourselves about our future? And what has made human beings uniquely successful as a species is our ability to cooperate. And we are a storytelling species. What is the story that we tell ourselves at the moment about ourselves, about our past, and about our future? And how can we turn that story into one where we actually have the ability to dream again?
100 billion we're talking about at the moment, and we can't even be bothered to dip in our pockets for that. 100 billion, that's 1/20 of the UK's GDP. That's what the rich countries are going to put into the poor countries each year.
The insurance that, that we African countries we get from the European countries, yes, that money is invested into African countries and so, But then at the end of the day, you put money into African countries for them to be able to cope with the climate crisis, but then that money never really reaches the people it's supposed to reach because our governments at the top, they are not doing their jobs properly. So at the end of the day, you can invest how much into an African country to combat climate crisis, but as long as you are not doing a follow-up on how that money was used in that specific country, you are really not helping the people at the bottom. They do not know what the climate crisis is. You come to them, you talk about the climate crisis, and they do not understand. They blame God for what is happening. They do not blame, they do not blame like countries or companies that give out all these emissions. They blame God because they do not understand. So I feel like a lot of attention should be given to creating awareness to what the climate crisis is. And then maybe people will be able to better adapt.
This is a social science problem. As I've looked at this issue over the years I've been working on it, it's not that we lack the information. It's really a question that I think the human brain isn't particularly well suited for assessing catastrophic risk. We knew a pandemic would come. 1918, we knew there are plenty of reports a pandemic would be here. Did we adequately prepare? No. We know that climate change is afoot, that we're already seeing faster change, but are we acting with the necessary alacrity? No. And there are a number of the social scientists have identified the biases. We're optimists. That's good. It's good to be an optimist. It helps us get through life. That's why in the United States, we have something like, many, many people walking down the aisle at a wedding and saying, "Till death do us part," when we have a 50% divorce rate. So that's optimism. That's helpful. But the optimism hurts us when we're assessing the risk from climate change. We are not accurately looking ahead to the billions of people that will be without food, water, and this very dark picture that's being painted. Hard for us to adjust that. We also rely on recency bias, and that's why all of these codes, building codes, other things look to our past. That's how we judge risk. Have we or a close friend experienced the risk? And until we have, we tend to think it won't hit us. Won't hit me. I'm an optimist. That's going to hit somebody else in another country somewhere. And until it hits us, only then do we act. And then sometimes even when you're the victim of flooding, you're going to say it's not going to happen again. It was a freak accident. You're still not going to look at the science. And that climate literacy or the lack of education in our schools is very much undermining our ability to make sure that we have the ready task force. But we need to educate our leaders now as well. As you said, we cannot wait entirely until the young people. And how do we do that? I think we do that one place in the financial markets is through regulation, requiring companies to look at their climate risk, both the risk of transition to the bottom line, that is to green energy, as well as the risk of impacts to their operations and their facilities.
Well, certainly we should be having that in the schools. It seems ridiculous to me that it's not an embedded key part of our education systems. That seems strange, and hopefully not in the sort of way that we've been doing for the last 200 years, where we isolate everything off into its different disciplinary silos. We need to recognise what the sorts of challenges that we're facing with 8 to 10 billion people on the planet is that they're much more system oriented. So we need to find ways to cross over the boundaries between disciplines. I think it's one of the reasons we've struggled with climate change. It's the first really big system challenge that we've had to face, and we're realising that we're not really equipped, because we've had 200 years of really very effective reductionism, which has been very good. It has worked well, but it doesn't help us address these sort of system issues. Responding to climate change is deeply cultural. So it's not one message. There isn't one message out there. We need multiple ways of engaging. And the sorts of challenges you're pointing out in Namibia will require very different sets of messages and engagement than if you're doing that in some other part of the world where the population might be better educated. No brighter, but certainly better educated. So I think we have to colour our messages and our narratives to the cultural environments where we're operating in.
We can't have a planet of middle-class people. And yet that's what we would all like to see, because we all want to see them behaving like us. That means, and I agree with your shaking your head at that comment, we have to change our behavior. We are the exemplars and others are trying to imitate us. And so if we are flying around in jets, if we're driving SUVs, if we are consuming the planet, we're setting an example to the emerging global middle class. We consume far too much meat, right? There's nobody who's living healthily by consuming the vast average that we middle class people in the West are consuming. So there's all of these behavior patterns. Let's set an example.